Section 19 of The Idea of Progress by J. B. Barry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Search for a Law of Progress. 1. Saint-Simon. Amid the intellectual movements in France described in the last chapter, the idea of progress passed into a new phase of its growth. Hitherto it had been a vague, optimistic doctrine which encouraged the idealism of reformers and revolutionaries, but could not guide them. It had waited like a handmaid on the abstractions of nature and reason. It had hardly realized an independent life. The time had come for systematic attempts to probe its meaning and definitely to ascertain the direction in which humanity is moving. Comte had said that a Kepler or a Newton was needed to find the law of the movement of civilization. Several Frenchmen now undertook to solve the problem. They did not solve it, but the new science of sociology was founded, and the idea of progress, which presided at its birth, has been its principal problem ever since. 1. The three thinkers who claimed to have discovered the secret of social development had also in view the practical object of remolding society on general scientific principles, and they became the founders of sects, Fourier, Saint-Simon, and Comte. They all announced a new era of development as a necessary sequel of the past, an inevitable and desirable stage in the march of humanity, and delineated its features. Comte was the successor of Saint-Simon, as Saint-Simon himself was the successor of Condorcet. Fourier stands quite apart. He claimed that he broke entirely new ground, and acknowledged no masters. He regarded himself as a Newton for whom no Kepler or Galileo had prepared the way. The most important and sanest part of his work was the scheme for organizing society on a new principle of industrial cooperation. His general theory of the universe and man's destinies which lay behind his practical plans is so fantastic that it sounds like the dream of a lunatic, yet many accepted it as the apocalypse of an evangelist. Fourier was moved by the far-reaching effects of Newton's discovery to seek a law which would coordinate facts in the moral world as the principle of gravitation had coordinated facts in the physical world, and in 1808 he claimed to have found the secret in what he called the law of passional attraction. Footnote. Théorie des quatre mouvements et des destinées générales. General accounts of his theories will be found in Charles Fourier, Sa vie et sa théorie, by his disciple Dr. Charles Pellerin, 2nd edition, 1843, and in Flint, History of Philosophy of History in France, etc., pages 408 sequentes. End of footnote. The human passions have hitherto been sources of misery. The problem for man is to make them sources of happiness. If we know the law which governs them, we can make such changes in our environment that none of the passions will need to be curbed, and the free indulgence of one will not hinder or compromise the satisfaction of the others. His worthless law for harmonizing the passions without restraining them need not detain us. The structure of society, by which he proposed to realize the benefits of his discovery, was based on cooperation, but was not socialistic. The family, as a social unit, was to be replaced by a larger unit, phalange, economically self-sufficing and consisting of about 1,800 persons, who were to live together in a vast building, phalanstère, surrounded by a domain sufficient to produce all they required. Private property is not abolished. The community will include both rich and poor. All the products of their work are distributed in shares according to the labor, talents, and capital of each member, but a fixed minimum is assured to everyone. The scheme was actually tried on a small scale near the forest of Rambouillet in 1832. This transformation of society, which is to have the effect of introducing harmony among the passions, will mark the beginning of a new epoch. The duration of man's earthly career is 81,000 years, of which 5,000 have elapsed. He will now enter upon a long period of increasing harmony, which will be followed by an equal period of decline, like the way up and the way down of Heraclitus. His brief past, the age of his infancy, has been marked by a decline of happiness leading to the present age of civilization, which is thoroughly bad. Here we see the influence of Rousseau, and from it Fourier's discovery is the clue to lead humanity forth into the epoch in which harmony begins to emerge. But men who have lived in the bad ages need not be pitied, and those who live today need not be pessimistic. For Fourier believed in metempsychosis, and could tell you, as if he were the private secretary of the deity calculating the arithmetical details of the cosmic plan, how many very happy, tolerably happy, and unhappy lives fall to the lot of each soul during the whole 81,000 years. Nor does the prospect end with the life of the earth. The soul of the earth and the human souls attached to it will live again in comets, planets, and suns on a system of which Fourier knew all the particulars. Footnote. Details will be found in the Théorie de l'unité universelle, originally published under the title Association domestique agricole in 1822. End of footnote. These silly speculations would not deserve even this slight indication of their purport were it not that Fourier founded a sect and had a considerable body of devoted followers. His discovery was acclaimed by Béranger. Quote, Fourier nous dit, sort de la fange, peuple en proie aux déceptions travaille, groupé par phalange dans un cercle d'attraction. La terre, après tant de désastres, forme avec le ciel un humain, et la loi qui régit les astres donne la paix au genre humain. Close quote. 10 years after his death, 1837, an English writer tells us that, quote, the social theory of Fourier is at the present moment engrossing the attention and exciting the apprehensions of thinking men not only in France but in almost every country in Europe. Close quote. Grotesque as was the theoretical background of his doctrines, he helped to familiarize the world with the idea of indefinite progress. 2. Quote, the imagination of poets has placed the golden age in the cradle of the human race. It was the age of iron they should have banished there. The golden age is not behind us, but in front of us. It is the perfection of social order. Our fathers have not seen it, our children will arrive there one day, and it is for us to clear the way for them. Close quote. The Comte de Saint-Simon, who wrote these words in 1814, was one of the liberal nobles who had imbibed the ideas of the Voltairian age and sympathized with the spirit of the Revolution. In his literary career from 1803 to his death in 1825, he passed through several phases of thought, but his chief masters were always Condorcet and the physiologists, from whom he derived his two guiding ideas that ethics and politics depend ultimately on physics and that history is progress. Condorcet had interpreted history by the progressive movement of knowledge. That, Saint-Simon said, is the true principle, but Condorcet applied it narrowly and committed two errors. He did not understand the social import of religion, and he represented the Middle Ages as a useless interruption of the forward movement. Here Saint-Simon learned from the religious reaction. He saw that religion has a natural and legitimate social role and cannot be eliminated as a mere perversity. He expounded the doctrine that all social phenomena cohere. A religious system, he said, always corresponds to the stage of science which the society wherein it appears has reached. In fact, religion is merely science clothed in a form suitable to the emotional needs which it satisfies. And as a religious system is based on the contemporary phase of scientific development, so the political system of an epoch corresponds to the religious system. They all hang together. Medieval Europe does not represent a temporary triumph of obscurantism, useless and deplorable, but a valuable and necessary stage in human progress. It was a period in which an important principle of social organization was realized, the right relation of the spiritual and temporal powers. It is evident that these views transformed the theory of Condorcet into a more acceptable shape. So long as the medieval tract of time appeared to be an awkward episode, contributing nothing to the forward movement, but rather thwarting and retarding it, progress was exposed to the criticism that it was an arbitrary synthesis, only partly borne out by historical facts and supplying no guarantees for the future. And so long as rationalists of the encyclopedic school regarded religion as a tiresome product of ignorance and deceit, the social philosophy which lay behind the theory of progress was condemned as unscientific, because, in defiance of the close cohesion of social phenomena, it refused to admit that religion, as one of the chief of those phenomena, must itself participate and cooperate in progress. Condorcet had suggested that the value of history lies in affording data for foreseeing the future. Saint-Simon raised this suggestion to a dogma. But prevision was impossible on Condorcet's unscientific method. In order to foretell, the law of the movement must be discovered, and Condorcet had not found or even sought a law. The 18th century thinkers had left progress a mere hypothesis based on a very insufficient induction. Their successors sought to lift it to the rank of a scientific hypothesis by discovering a social law as valid as the physical law of gravitation. This was the object both of Saint-Simon and of Comte. The law which Saint-Simon educed from history was that epochs of organization or construction and epochs of criticism or revolution succeed each other alternately. The medieval period was a time of organization, and was followed by a critical revolutionary period which has now come to an end and must be succeeded by another epoch of organization. Having discovered the clue to the process, Saint-Simon is able to predict. As our knowledge of the universe has reached, or is reaching, a stage which is no longer conjectural but positive in all departments, society will be transformed accordingly. A new physicist religion will supersede Christianity and deism. Men of science will play the role of organizers which the clergy played in the Middle Ages. As the goal of the development is social happiness, and as the working classes form the majority, the first step towards the goal will be the amelioration of the lot of the working classes. This will be the principal problem of government in reorganizing society, and Saint-Simon's solution of the problem was socialism. He rejected the watchwords of liberalism, democracy, liberty, and equality, with as much disdain as de Maistre and the reactionaries. The announcement of a future age of gold, which I quoted above, is taken from a pamphlet which he issued in conjunction with his secretary, Augustin Thierry, the historian, after the fall of Napoleon. In it he revived the idea of the Abbé de Saint-Pierre for the abolition of war and proposed a new organization of Europe more ambitious and utopian than the Abbé's League of States. At this moment he saw in parliamentary government, which the restored Bourbons were establishing in France, a sovereign remedy for political disorder, and he imagined that if this political system were introduced in all the states of Europe, a long step would have been taken to the perpetuation of peace. If the old enemies, France and England, formed a close alliance, there would be little difficulty in creating ultimately a European state like the American Commonwealth, with a parliamentary government supreme over the state governments. Here is the germ of the idea of a Parliament of Man. 3. Saint-Simon, however, did not construct a definite system for the attainment of social perfection. He left it to disciples to develop the doctrine which he sketched. In the year of his death, 1825, Hollande Rodriguez and Enfantin founded a journal, the Producteur, to present to humanity the one thing which humanity, in the opinion of their master, then most needed, a new general doctrine. History shows that peoples have been moving from isolation to union, from war to peace, from antagonism to association. The program for the future is association scientifically organized. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages offered the example of a great social organization resting on a general doctrine. The modern world must also be a social organization, but the general doctrine will be scientific, not religious. The spiritual power must reside not in priests but in savants, who will direct the progress of science and public education. Each member of the community will have his place and duties assigned to him. Society consists of three classes of workers: industrial workers, savants, and artists. A commission of eminent workers of each class will determine the place of every individual according to his capacities. Complete equality is absurd. Inequality based on merit is reasonable and necessary. It is a modern error to distrust state authority. A power directing national forces is requisite to propose great ideas and to make the innovations necessary for progress. Such an organization will promote progress in all domains: in science by cooperation, in industry by credit, and in art too, for artists will learn to express the ideas and sentiments of their own age. There are signs already of a tendency towards something of this kind. Its realization must be procured, not by revolution, but by gradual change. In the authoritarian character of the organization to which these apostles of progress wished to entrust the destinies of man, we may see the influence of the great theocrat and antagonist of progress, Joseph de Maistre. He taught them the necessity of a strong central power and the danger of liberty. But the fullest exposition of the Saint-Simonian doctrine of development was given by Bazard, one of the chief disciples, a few years later. The human race is conceived as a collective being which unfolds its nature in the course of generations, according to a law, the law of progress, which may be called the physiological law of the human species, and was discovered by Saint-Simon. It consists in the alternation of organic and critical epochs. In an organic epoch, men discern a destination and harmonize all their energies to reach it. In a critical epoch, they are not conscious of a goal, and their efforts are dispersed and discordant. There was an organic period in Greece before the age of Socrates. It was succeeded by a critical epoch lasting to the barbarian invasions. Then came an organic period in the homogeneous societies of Europe from Charlemagne to the end of the 15th century, and a new critical period opened with Luther and has lasted till today. Now it is time to prepare the advent of the organic age which must necessarily follow. The most salient fact observable in history is the continual extension of the principle of association in the series of family, city, nation, supranational church. The next term must be a still vaster association comprehending the whole race. In consequence of the incompleteness of association, the exploitation of the weak by the strong has been a capital feature in human societies, but its successive forms exhibit a gradual mitigation. Cannibalism is followed by slavery, slavery by serfdom, and finally comes industrial exploitation by the capitalist. This latest form of the oppression of the weak depends on the right of property, and the remedy is to transfer the right of inheriting the property of the individual from the family to the state. The society of the future must be socialistic. The new social doctrine must not only be diffused by education and legislation, it must be sanctioned by a new religion. Christianity will not serve, for Christianity is founded on a dualism between matter and spirit, and has laid a curse on matter. The new religion must be monistic, and its principles are, briefly, God is one, God is all that is, all is God. He is universal love, revealing itself as mind and matter. And to this triad correspond the three domains of religion, science, and industry. In combining their theory with a philosophical religion, the Saint-Simonian school was not only true to its master's teaching, but obeying an astute instinct. As a purely secular movement for the transformation of society, their doctrine would not have reaped the same success or inspired the same enthusiasm. They were probably influenced, too, by the pamphlet of Lessing, to which Madame de Staël had invited attention, and which one of Saint-Simon's disciples translated. The fortunes of the school, the life of the community at Ménilmontant under the direction of Enfantin, the persecution, the heresies, the dispersion, the attempt to propagate the movement in Egypt, the philosophical activity of Enfantin and Lemonnier under the Second Empire, do not claim our attention. The curious story is told in M. Weil's admirable monograph. The sect is now extinct, but its influence was wide in its day, and it propagated faith in progress as the key to history and the law of collective life. Footnote: Two able converts to the ideas of Saint-Simon seceded from the school at an early stage in consequence of Enfantin's aberrations. Pierre Leroux, whom we shall meet again, and P.J.B. Boucher, who in 1833 published a thoughtful Introduction à la science de l'histoire, where history is defined as, quote, a science whose end is to foresee the social future of the human species in the order of its free activity. Close quote. End of footnote. End of section 19. Section 20 of The Idea of Progress by J.B. Barry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The Search for a Law of Progress. 2. Comte. 1. Auguste Comte did more than any preceding thinker to establish the idea of progress as a luminary which could not escape men's vision. The brilliant suggestions of Saint-Simon, the writings of Bézard and Enfantin, the vagaries of Fourier, might be dismissed as curious rather than serious propositions, but the massive system wrought out by Comte's speculative genius, his organic scheme of human knowledge, his elaborate analysis of history, his new science of sociology, was a great fact with which European thought was forced to reckon. The soul of this system was progress, and the most important problem he set out to solve was the determination of its laws. His originality is not dimmed by the fact that he owed to Saint-Simon more than he afterwards admitted, or than his disciples have been willing to allow. He collaborated with him for several years, and at this time enthusiastically acknowledged the intellectual stimulus he received from the elder savant. But he derived from Saint-Simon much more than the stimulation of his thoughts in a certain direction. He was indebted to him for some of the characteristic ideas of his own system. He was indebted to him for the principle which lay at the very basis of his system, that the social phenomena of a given period and the intellectual state of the society cohere and correspond. The conception that the coming age was to be a period of organization like the Middle Ages, and the idea of the government of savants are pure Saint-Simonian doctrine, and the fundamental idea of a positive philosophy had been apprehended by Saint-Simon long before he was acquainted with his youthful associate. But Comte had a more methodical and scientific mind, and he thought that Saint-Simon was premature in drawing conclusions as to the reformation of societies and industries before the positive philosophy had been constructed. He published, he was then only 22, in 1822 a plan of the scientific operations necessary for the reorganization of society, which was published under another title 2 years later by Saint-Simon, and it was over this that the friends quarreled. This work contains the principles of the positive philosophy which he was soon to begin to work out. It announces already the law of the 3 stages. The first volume of the Cours de philosophie positive appeared in 1830. It took him 12 years more to complete the exposition of his system. 2. The law of 3 stages is familiar to many who have never read a line of his writings. That men first attempted to explain natural phenomena by the operation of imaginary deities, then sought to interpret them by abstractions, and finally came to see that they could only be understood by scientific methods, observation, and experiment, this was a generalization which had already been thrown out by Turgot. Comte adopted it as a fundamental psychological law, which has governed every domain of mental activity and explains the whole story of human development. Each of our principal conceptions, every branch of knowledge, passes successively through these 3 states which he names the theological, the metaphysical, and the positive or scientific. In the first, the mind invents. In the second, it abstracts. In the third, it submits itself to positive facts. And the proof that any branch of knowledge has reached the 3rd stage is the recognition of invariable natural laws. But granting that this may be the key to the history of the sciences, of physics, say, or botany, how can it explain the history of man, the sequence of actual historical events? Comte replies that history has been governed by ideas. The whole social mechanism is ultimately based on opinions. Thus, man's history is essentially a history of his opinions, and these are subject to the fundamental psychological law. It must, however, be observed that all branches of knowledge are not in the same stage simultaneously. Some may have reached the metaphysical, while others are still lagging behind in the theological. Some may have become scientific, while others have not passed from the metaphysical. Thus, the study of physical phenomena has already reached the positive stage, but the study of social phenomena has not. The central aim of Comte, and his great achievement in his own opinion, was to raise the study of social phenomena from the 2nd to the 3rd stage. When we proceed to apply the law of the 3 stages to the general course of historical development, we are met at the outset by the difficulty that the advance in all the domains of activity is not simultaneous. If at a given period thought and opinions are partly in the theological, partly in the metaphysical, and partly in the scientific state, how is the law to be applied to general development? One class of ideas, Comte says, must be selected as the criterion, and this class must be that of social and moral ideas, for 2 reasons. In the first place, social science occupies the highest rank in the hierarchy of sciences, on which he laid great stress. In the second, those ideas play the principal part for the majority of men, and the most ordinary phenomena are the most important to consider. When, in other classes of ideas, the advance is at any time more rapid, this only means an indispensable preparation for the ensuing period. The movement of history is due to the deeply rooted though complex instinct which pushes man to ameliorate his condition incessantly, to develop in all ways the sum of his physical, moral, and intellectual life. And all the phenomena of his social life are closely cohesive, as Saint-Simon had pointed out. By virtue of this cohesion, political, moral, and intellectual progress are inseparable from material progress, and so we find that the phases of his material development correspond to intellectual changes. The principle of consensus or solidarity, which secures harmony and order in the development, is as important as the principle of the 3 stages which governs the onward movement. This movement, however, is not in a right line, but displays a series of oscillations, unequal and variable, round a mean motion which tends to prevail. The 3 general causes of variation, according to Comte, are race, climate, and deliberate political action, such as the retrograde policies of Julian the Apostate or Napoleon. But while they cause deflections and oscillation, their power is strictly limited. They may accelerate or retard the movement, but they cannot invert its order. They may affect the intensity of the tendencies in a given situation, but cannot change their nature. 3. In the demonstration of his laws by the actual course of civilization, Comte adopts what he calls the happy artifice of Condorcet, and treats the successive peoples who pass on the torch as if they were a single people running the race. This is a rational fiction, for a people's true successors are those who pursue its efforts. And, like Bossuet and Condorcet, he confined his review to European civilization. He considered only the élite or advance guard of humanity. He deprecated the introduction of China or India, for instance, as a confusing complication. He ignored the roles of Brahmanism, Buddhism, Mohammedanism. His synthesis, therefore, cannot claim to be a synthesis of universal history. It is only a synthesis of the movement of European history. In accordance with the law of the 3 stages, the development falls into 3 great periods. The first, or theological, came to an end about A.D. 1400, and the second, or metaphysical, is now nearing its close to make way for the third, or positive, for which Comte was preparing the way. The theological period has itself 3 stages, in which fetishism, polytheism, and monotheism successively prevail. The chief social characteristics of the polytheistic period are the institution of slavery and the coincidence or confusion of the spiritual and temporal powers. It has 2 stages, the theocratic, represented by Egypt, and the military, represented by Rome, between which Greece stands in a rather embarrassing and uneasy position. The initiative for the passage to the monotheistic period came from Judea, and Comte attempts to show that this could not have been otherwise. His analysis of this period is the most interesting part of his survey. The chief feature of the political system corresponding to monotheism is the separation of the spiritual and temporal powers, the function of the spiritual power being concerned with education, and that of the temporal with action, in the wide senses of those terms. The defects of this dual system were due to the irrational theology. But the theory of papal infallibility was a great step in intellectual and social progress, by providing a final jurisdiction without which society would have been troubled incessantly by contests arising from the vague formulae of dogmas. Here Comte had learned from Joseph de Maistre. But that thinker would not have been edified when Comte went on to declare that in the passage from polytheism to monotheism, the religious spirit had really declined, and that one of the merits of Catholicism was that it augmented the domain of human wisdom at the expense of divine inspiration. If it be said that the Catholic system promoted the empire of the clergy rather than the interests of religion, this was all to the good, for it placed the practical use of religion in, quote, the provisional elevation of a noble speculative corporation eminently able to direct opinions and morals. Close quote. But Catholic monotheism could not escape dissolution. The metaphysical spirit began to operate powerfully on the notions of moral philosophy as soon as the Catholic organization was complete, and Catholicism, because it could not assimilate this intellectual movement, lost its progressive character and stagnated. The decay began in the 14th century, where Comte dates the beginning of the metaphysical period, a period of revolution and disorder. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the movement is spontaneous and unconscious. From the 16th till today, it has proceeded under the direction of a philosophical spirit which is negative and not constructive. This critical philosophy has only accelerated a decomposition which began spontaneously. For as theology progresses, it becomes less consistent and less durable, and as its conceptions become less irrational, the intensity of the emotions which they excite decreases. Fetishism had deeper roots than polytheism and lasted longer, and polytheism surpassed monotheism in vigor and vitality. Yet the critical philosophy was necessary to exhibit the growing need of solid reorganization and to prove that the decaying system was incapable of directing the world any longer. Logically, it was very imperfect, but it was justified by its success. The destructive work was mainly done in the 17th century by Hobbes, Spinoza, and Bayle, of whom Hobbes was the most effective. In the 18th, all prominent thinkers participated in developing this negative movement, and Rousseau gave it the practical stimulus which saved it from degenerating into an unfruitful agitation. Of particular importance was the great fallacy, which Helvetius propagated, that human intellects are equal. This error was required for the full development of the critical doctrine, for it supported the dogmas of popular sovereignty and social equality, and justified the principle of the right of private judgment. These 3 principles, popular sovereignty, equality, and what he calls the right of free examination, are in Comte's eyes vicious and anarchical. But it was necessary that they should be promulgated, because the transition from one organized social system to another cannot be direct. It requires an anarchical interregnum. Popular sovereignty is opposed to orderly institutions, and condemns all superior persons to dependence on the multitude of their inferiors. Equality, obviously anarchical in its tendency and obviously untrue, for as men are not equal or even equivalent to one another, their rights cannot be identical, was similarly necessary to break down the old institutions. The universal claim to the right of free judgment merely consecrates the transitional state of unlimited liberty in the interim between the decline of theology and the arrival of positive philosophy. Comte further remarks that the fall of the spiritual power had led to anarchy in international relations, and if the spirit of nationality were to prevail too far, the result would be a state of things inferior to that of the Middle Ages. But Comte says for the metaphysical spirit in France that, with all its vices, it was more disengaged from the prejudices of the old theological regime, and nearer to a true rational positivism than either the German mysticism or the English empiricism of the same period. The Revolution was a necessity, to disclose the chronic decomposition of society from which it resulted, and to liberate the modern social elements from the grip of the ancient powers. Comte has praise for the Convention, which he contrasts with the Constituent Assembly with its political fictions and inconsistencies. He pointed out that the great vice in the metaphysics of the crisis, that is, in the principles of the revolutionaries, lay in conceiving society out of relation to the past, in ignoring the Middle Ages and borrowing from Greek and Roman society retrograde and contradictory ideals. Napoleon restored order, but he was more injurious to humanity than any other historical person. His moral and intellectual nature was incompatible with the true direction of progress, which involves the extinction of the theological and military regime of the past. Thus his work, like Julian the Apostate's, exhibits an instance of deflection from the line of progress. Then came the parliamentary system of the restored Bourbons, which Comte designates as a political utopia, destitute of social principles, a foolish attempt to combine political retrogression with a state of permanent peace. 4. The critical doctrine has performed its historical function, and the time has come for man to enter upon the positive stage of his career. To enable him to take this step forward, it is necessary that the study of social phenomena should become a positive science. As social science is the highest in the hierarchy of sciences, it could not develop until the two branches of knowledge which come next in the scale, biology and chemistry, assumed a scientific form. This has recently been achieved, and it is now possible to found a scientific sociology. This science, like mechanics and biology, has its statics and its dynamics. The first studies the laws of coexistence, the second those of succession. The first contains the theory of order, the second that of progress. The law of consensus or cohesion is the fundamental principle of social statics. The law of the three stages is that of social dynamics. Comte's survey of history, of which I have briefly indicated the general character, exhibits the application of these sociological laws. The capital feature of the third period, which we are now approaching, will be the organization of society by means of scientific sociology. The world will be guided by a general theory, and this means that it must be controlled by those who understand the theory and will know how to apply it. Therefore, society will revive the principle which was realized in the great period of monotheism, the distinction of a spiritual and a temporal order. But the spiritual order will consist of savants who will direct social life not by theological fictions, but by the positive truths of science. They will administer a system of universal education and will draw up the final code of ethics. They will be able, more effectively than the Church, to protect the interests of the lower classes. Comte's conviction that the world is prepared for a transformation of this kind is based principally on signs of the decline of the theological spirit and of the military spirit, which he regarded as the two main obstacles to the reign of reason. Catholicism, he says, is now no more than an imposing historical ruin. As for militarism, the epoch has arrived in which serious and lasting warfare among the elite nations will totally cease. The last general cause of warfare has been the competition for colonies, but the colonial policy is now in its decadence, with the temporary exception of England, so that we need not look for future trouble from this source. The very sophism sometimes put forward to justify war, that it is an instrument of civilization, is a homage to the pacific nature of modern society. We need not follow further the details of Comte's forecast of the positive period, except to mention that he did not contemplate a political federation. The great European nations will develop each in its own way, with their separate temporal organizations. But he contemplated the intervention of a common spiritual power, so that all nationalities, quote, under the direction of a homogeneous speculative class, will contribute to an identical work, in a spirit of active European patriotism, not of sterile cosmopolitanism. Close quote. Comte claimed, like Saint-Simon, that the data of history, scientifically interpreted, afford the means of prevision. It is interesting to observe how he failed himself as a diviner, how utterly he misapprehended the vitality of Catholicism, how completely his prophecy as to the cessation of wars was belied by the event. He lived to see the Crimean War. Footnote. He died in 1857. End of footnote. As a diviner, he failed as completely as Saint-Simon and Fourier, whose dream that the 19th century would see the beginning of an epoch of harmony and happiness was to be fulfilled by a deadly struggle between capitalism and labor, the Civil War in America, the War of 1870, the Commune, Russian pogroms, Armenian massacres, and finally the universal catastrophe of 1914. 5. For the comprehension of history we have perhaps gained as little from Comte's positive laws as from Hegel's metaphysical categories. Both thinkers had studied the facts of history only slightly and partially, a rather serious drawback which enabled them to impose their own constructions with the greater ease. Hegel's method of a priori synthesis was enjoined by his philosophical theory, but in Comte we also find a tendency to a priori treatment. He expressly remarks that the chief social features of the monotheistic period might almost be constructed a priori. The law of the three stages is discredited. It may be contended that general progress depends on intellectual progress, and that theology, metaphysics, and science have common roots and are ultimately identical, being merely phases in the movement of the intelligence. But the law of this movement, if it is to rank as a scientific hypothesis, must be properly deduced from known causes, and must then be verified by a comparison with historical facts. Comte thought that he fulfilled these requirements, but in both respects his demonstration was defective. The gravest weakness, perhaps, in his historical sketch is the gratuitous assumption that man in the earliest stage of his existence had animistic beliefs, and that the first phase of his progress was controlled by fetishism. There is no valid evidence that fetishism is not a relatively late development, or that in the myriads of years stretching back beyond our earliest records, during which men decided the future of the human species by their technical inventions and the discovery of fire, they had any views which could be called religious or theological. The psychology of modern savages is no clue to the minds of the people who wrought tools of stone in the world of the mammoth and the rhinoceros ticorhinus. If the first stage of man's development, which was of such critical importance for his destinies, was pre-animistic, Comte's law of progress fails, for it does not cover the ground. In another way, Comte's system may be criticized for failing to cover the ground, if it is regarded as a philosophy of history. In accordance with the happy artifice of Condorcet, he assumes that the growth of European civilization is the only history that matters, and discards entirely the civilizations, for instance, of India and China. This assumption is much more than an artifice, and he has not scientifically justified it. The reader of the Philosophie Positive will also observe that Comte has not grappled with the fundamental question which has to be faced in unraveling the woof of history or seeking a law of events. I mean the question of contingency. It must be remembered that contingency does not in the least affect the doctrine of determinism. It is compatible with the strictest interpretation of the principle of causation. A particular example may be taken to show what it implies. It may plausibly be argued that a military dictatorship was an inevitable sequence of the French Revolution. This may not be true, but let us assume it. Let us further assume that, given Napoleon, it was inevitable that he should be the dictator. But Napoleon's existence was due to an independent causal chain which had nothing whatever to do with the course of political events. He might have died in his boyhood by disease or by an accident, and the fact that he survived was due to causes which were similarly independent of the causal chain which, as we are assuming, led necessarily to an epoch of monarchical government. The existence of a man of his genius and character at the given moment was a contingency which profoundly affected the course of history. If he had not been there, another dictator would have grasped the helm, but obviously would not have done what Napoleon did. It is clear that the whole history of man has been modified at every stage by such contingencies, which may be defined as the collisions of two independent causal chains. Voltaire was perfectly right when he emphasized the role of chance in history, though he did not realize what it meant. This factor would explain the oscillations and deflections which Comte admits in the movement of historical progression. But the question arises whether it may not also have once and again definitely altered the direction of the movement. Can the factor be regarded as virtually negligible by those who, like Comte, are concerned with the large perspective of human development and not with the details of an episode? Or was Renouvier right in principle when he maintained, quote, the real possibility that the sequence of events from the Emperor Nerva to the Emperor Charlemagne might have been radically different from what it actually was? Close quote. Footnote. He illustrated this proposition by a fanciful reconstruction of European history from 100 to 800 AD in his Uchronie, 1876. He contended that there is no definite law of progress. Quote, the true law lies in the equal possibility of progress or regress for societies as for individuals. Close quote. End of footnote. 6. It does not concern us here to examine the defects of Comte's view of the course of European history, but it interests us to observe that his synthesis of human progress is, like Hegel's, what I have called a closed system. Just as his own absolute philosophy marked for Hegel the highest and ultimate term of human development, so for Comte the coming society whose organization he adumbrated was the final state of humanity beyond which there would be no further movement. It would take time to perfect the organization, and the period would witness a continuous increase of knowledge, but the main characteristics were definitely fixed. Comte did not conceive that the distant future, could he survive to experience it, could contain any surprises for him. His theory of progress thus differed from the 18th century views which vaguely contemplate an indefinite development and only profess to indicate some general tendencies. He expressly repudiated this notion of indefinite progress. The data, he said, justify only the inference of continuous progress, which is a different thing. A second point in which Comte, in his view of progress, differed from the French philosophers of the preceding age is this. Condorcet and his predecessors regarded it exclusively from the eudaimonic point of view. The goal of progress for them was the attainment of human felicity. With felicity, Comte is hardly more concerned than Hegel. The establishment of a fuller harmony between men and their environment in the third stage will no doubt mean happiness, but this consideration lies outside the theory, and to introduce it would only intrude an unscientific element into the analysis. The course of development is determined by intellectual ideas, and he treats these as independent of, and indifferent to, eudaimonic motives. A third point to be noted is the authoritarian character of the regime of the future. Comte's ideal state would be as ill to live in for any unfortunate being who values personal liberty as a theocracy or any socialistic utopia. He had as little sympathy with liberty as Plato or as Bossuet, and less than the 18th century philosophers. This feature, common to Comte and the Saint-Simonians, was partly due to the reaction against the Revolution, but it also resulted from the logic of the man of science. If sociological laws are positively established as certainly as the law of gravitation, no room is left for opinion. Right social conduct is definitely fixed. The proper functions of every member of society admit of no question. Therefore, the claim to liberty is perverse and irrational. It is the same argument which some modern exponents of eugenics use to advocate a state tyranny in the matter of human breeding. When Comte was writing, the progressive movement in Europe was towards increase of liberty in all its forms, national, civic, political, and economical. On one hand, there was the agitation for the release of oppressed nationalities, on the other, the growth of liberalism in England and France. The aim of the liberalism of that period was to restrict the functions of government. Its spirit was distrust of the state. As a political theory, it was defective, as modern liberals acknowledge, but it was an important expression of the feeling that the interests of society are best furthered by the free interplay of individual actions and aims. It thus implicitly contained or pointed to a theory of progress sharply opposed to Comte's, that the realization of the fullest possible measure of individual liberty is the condition of ensuring the maximum of energy and effectiveness in improving our environment, and therefore the condition of attaining public felicity. Right or wrong, this theory reckons with fundamental facts of human nature which Comte ignored. 7. Comte spent the later years of his life in composing another huge work on social reorganization. It included a new religion, in which humanity was the object of worship, but made no other important addition to the speculations of his earlier manhood, though he developed them further. The Course of Positive Philosophy was not a book that took the public by storm. We are told by a competent student of social theories in France that the author's name was little known in his own country till about 1855, when his greatness began to win recognition and his influence to operate. Even then, his work can hardly have been widely read. But through men like Littré and Taine, whose conceptions of history were molded by his teaching, and men like Mill, whom he stimulated, as well as through the disciples who adopted positivism as a religion, his leading principles, detached from his system, became current in the world of speculation. He laid the foundations of sociology, convincing many minds that the history of civilization is subject to general laws, or, in other words, that a science of society is possible. In England, this idea was still a novelty when Mill's System of Logic appeared in 1843. The publication of this work, which attempted to define the rules for the investigation of truth in all fields of inquiry and to provide tests for the hypotheses of science, was a considerable event, whether we regard its value and range or its prolonged influence on education. Mill, who had followed recent French thought attentively and was particularly impressed by the system of Comte, recognized that a new method of investigating social phenomena had been inaugurated by the thinkers who set out to discover the law of human progression. He proclaimed and welcomed it as superior to previous methods, and at the same time pointed out its limitations. Till about 50 years ago, he said, generalizations on man and society have erred by implicitly assuming that human nature and society will forever revolve in the same orbit and exhibit virtually the same phenomena. This is still the view of the ostentatiously practical votaries of common sense in Great Britain, whereas the more reflective minds of the present age, analyzing historical records more minutely, have adopted the opinion that the human race is in a state of necessary progression. The reciprocal action between circumstances and human nature, from which social phenomena result, must produce either a cycle or a trajectory. While Vico maintained the conception of periodic cycles, his successors have universally adopted the idea of a trajectory or progress, and are endeavoring to discover its law. But they have fallen into a misconception in imagining that if they can find a law of uniformity in the succession of events, they can infer the future from the past terms of the series. For such a law would only be an empirical law. It would not be a causal law or an ultimate law. However rigidly uniform, there is no guarantee that it would apply to phenomena outside those from which it was derived. It must itself depend on laws of mind and character, psychology and ethology. When those laws are known, and the nature of the dependences explained, when the determining causes of all the changes constituting the progress are understood, then the empirical law will be elevated to a scientific law. Then only will it be possible to predict. Thus Mill asserted that if the advanced thinkers who are engaged on the subject succeed in discovering an empirical law from the data of history, it may be converted into a scientific law by deducing it a priori from the principles of human nature. In the meantime, he argued that what is already known of those principles justifies the important conclusion that the order of general human progression will mainly depend on the order of progression in the intellectual convictions of mankind. Throughout his exposition, Mill uses progress in a neutral sense, without implying that the progression necessarily means improvement. Social science has still to demonstrate that the changes determined by human nature do mean improvement. But in warning the reader of this, he declares himself to be personally an optimist, believing that the general tendency, saving temporary exceptions, is in the direction of a better and happier state. 8. 20 years later, Mill was able to say that the conception of history as subject to general laws had, quote, passed into the domain of newspaper and ordinary political discussion, close quote. Buckle's History of Civilization in England, which enjoyed an immediate success, did a great deal to popularize the idea. In this stimulating work, Buckle took the fact of progress for granted. His purpose was to investigate its causes. Considering the two general conditions on which all events depend, human nature and external nature, he arrived at two conclusions. 1. In the early stage of history, the influence of man's external environment is the more decisive factor. But as time goes on, the roles are gradually inverted, and now it is his own nature that is principally responsible for his development. 2. Progress is determined not by the emotional and moral faculties, but by the intellect. Footnote. This was the view of Geoffroy, Comte, and Mill. Buckle popularized it. End of footnote. The emotional and moral faculties are stationary, and therefore religion is not a decisive influence in the onward movement of humanity. Quote, I pledge myself to show that the progress Europe has made from barbarism to civilization is entirely due to its intellectual activity. In what may be called the innate and original morals of mankind, there is, so far as we are aware, no progress. Close quote. Buckle was convinced that social phenomena exhibit the same undeviating regularity as natural phenomena. In this belief he was chiefly influenced by the investigations of the Belgian statistician Quetelet, 1835. Statistics, he said, quote, has already thrown more light on the study of human nature than all the sciences put together. Close quote. From the regularity with which the same crimes recur in the same state of society, and many other constant averages, he inferred that all actions of individuals result directly from the state of society in which they live, and that laws are operating which, if we take large enough numbers into account, scarcely undergo any sensible perturbation. Footnote. Kant had already appealed to statistics in a similar sense. End of footnote. Thus the evidence of statistics points to the conclusion that progress is not determined by the acts of individual men, but depends on general laws of the intellect which govern the successive stages of public opinion. The totality of human actions at any given time depends on the totality of knowledge and the extent of its diffusion. There we have the theory that history is subject to general laws in its most unqualified form, based on a fallacious view of the significance of statistical facts. Buckle's attempt to show the operation of general laws in the actual history of man was disappointing. When he went on to review the concrete facts of the historical process, his own political principles came into play, and he was more concerned with denouncing the tendencies of which he did not approve than with extricating general laws from the sequence of events. His comments on religious persecution and the obscurantism of governments and churches were instructive and timely, but they did not do much to exhibit a set of rigid laws governing and explaining the course of human development. The doctrine that history is under the irresistible control of law was also popularized by an American physiologist, J. W. Draper, whose History of the Intellectual Development of Europe appeared in 1864 and was widely read. His starting point was a superficial analogy between a society and an individual. Social advancement is as completely under the control of natural law as a bodily growth. The life of an individual is a miniature of the life of a nation, and particles in the individual organism answer to persons in the political organism. Both have the same epochs: infancy, childhood, youth, manhood, old age, and therefore European progress exhibits 5 phases, designated as credulity, inquiry, faith, reason, decrepitude. Draper's conclusion was that Europe, now in the 4th period, is hastening to a long period of decrepitude. The prospect did not dismay him. Decrepitude is the culmination of progress and means the organization of national intellect. That has already been achieved in China, and she owes to it her well-being and longevity. Quote, Europe is inevitably hastening to become what China is. In her we may see what we shall be like when we are old. Close quote. Judged by any standard, Draper's work is much inferior to Buckle's, but both these books, utterly different though they were in both conception and treatment, performed a similar function. Each in its own way diffused the view which had originated in France, that civilization is progression and, like nature, subject to general laws. End of section 20. Section 21 of The Idea of Progress by J. B. Barry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Progress in the French Revolutionary Movement, 1830 to 1851. 1. In 1850 there appeared at Paris a small book by M. A. Javary with the title De l'idée du progrès. Its interest lies in the express recognition that progress was the characteristic idea of the age, ardently received by some, hotly denounced by others. If there is any idea, he says, quote, that belongs properly to one century, at least by the importance accorded to it, and that, whether accepted or not, is familiar to all minds, It is the idea of progress conceived as the general law of history and the future of humanity." Close quote. He observes that some, intoxicated by the spectacle of the material improvements of modern civilization and the results of science, set no limits to man's power or his hopes, while others, unable to deny the facts, say that this progress serves only the lower part of human nature, and refuse to look with complacency on a movement which means, they assert, a continuous decadence of the nobler part. To which it is replied that if moral decadence is a fact, it is only transient. It is a necessary phase of a development which means moral progress in the end, for it is due to the process by which the beliefs, ideas, and institutions of the past disappear and make way for new and better principles. And Javary notes a prevailing tendency in France to interpret every contemporary movement as progressive, while all the social doctrinaires justify their particular reforms by invoking the law of progress. It was quite true that during the July monarchy nearly all serious speculations on society and history were related to that idea. It was common to Michelet and Quinet, who saw in the march of civilization the gradual triumph of liberty, to Leroux and Cabet, who preached humanitarian communism, to Louis Blanc and to Proudhon, to the bourgeois who were satisfied with the regime of Louis Philippe and grew rich, following the precept of Guizot, as well as to the workers who overthrew it. It is significant that the journal of Louis Blanc, in which he published his book on the Organization of Work, 1839, was entitled Revue des Progrès. The political question as to the due limits between government and individual freedom was discussed in terms of progress. Is personal liberty or state authority the efficient means of progressing? The metaphysical question of necessity and free will acquired a new interest. Is progress a fatality, independent of human purposes, determined by general, ineluctable historical laws? Quinet and Michelet argued vigorously against the optimism of Cousin, who with Hegel held that history is just what it ought to be and could not be improved. 2. Among the competing theories of the time, and sharply opposed to the views of Comte, was the idea, derived from the Revolution, that the world is moving towards universal equality and the obliteration of class distinctions, that this is the true direction of progress. This view, represented by leaders of the popular movement against the bourgeois ascendancy, derived powerful reinforcement from one of the most enlightened political thinkers of the day. The appearance of de Tocqueville's renowned study of American democracy was the event of 1834. He was convinced that he had discovered on the other side of the Atlantic the answer to the question whither the world is tending. In American society, he found that equality of conditions is the generating fact on which every other fact depends. He concluded that equality is the goal of humanity, providentially designed. Quote, "The gradual development of equality of conditions has the principal characteristics of a providential fact. It is universal, it is permanent, it eludes human power. All events and all men serve this development. This whole book has been written under the impression of a sort of religious terror produced in the author's soul by the view of this irresistible revolution which for so many centuries has been marching across all obstacles, and which is today seen still advancing in the midst of the ruins it has made. If the men of our time were brought to see that the gradual and progressive development of equality is at once the past and the future of their history, this single discovery would give that development the sacred character of the will of the sovereign master." Close quote. Here we have a view of the direction of progress and the meaning of history, pretending to be based upon the study of facts and announced with the most intense conviction. And behind it is the fatalistic doctrine that the movement cannot be arrested or diverted, that it is useless to struggle against it, that men, whatever they may do, cannot deflect the clock-like motion regulated by a power which de Tocqueville calls providence, but to which his readers might give some other name. 3. It has been conjectured, and seems probable enough, that de Tocqueville's book was one of the influences which wrought upon the mind of Proudhon. The speculations of this remarkable man, who, like Saint-Simon and Comte, sought to found a new science of society, attracted general attention in the middle of the century. His hostility to religion, his notorious dictum that property is theft, his gospel of anarchy, and the defiant, precipitous phrases in which he clothed his ideas, created an impression that he was a dangerous antisocial revolutionary. But when his ideas are studied in their context and translated into sober language, they are not so unreasonable. Notwithstanding his communistic theory of property and his ideal of equality, he was a strong individualist. He held that the future of civilization depends on the energy of individuals, that liberty is a condition of its advance, and that the end to be kept in view is the establishment of justice, which means equality. He saw the difficulty of reconciling liberty with complete equality, but hoped that the incompatibility would be overcome by a gradual reduction of the natural differences in men's capacities. He said, "I am an anarchist," but his anarchy only meant that the time would come when government would be superfluous, when every human being could be trusted to act wisely and morally without a restraining authority or external sanctions. Nor was he a utopian. He comprehended that such a transformation of society would be a long, slow process, and he condemned the schools of Saint-Simon and Fourier for imagining that a millennium might be realized immediately by a change of organization. He tells us that all his speculations and controversial activities are penetrated with the idea of progress, which he described as the railway of liberty, and his radical criticism on current social theories, whether conservative or democratic, was that they did not take progress seriously, though they invoked it. Quote, "What dominates in all my studies, what forms their beginning and end, their summit and their base, their reason, what makes my originality as a thinker, if I have any, is that I affirm progress resolutely, irrevocably, and everywhere, and deny the absolute. All that I have ever written, all I have denied or affirmed, I have written, denied, or affirmed in the name of one unique idea, progress. My adversaries, on the other hand, are all partisans of the absolute, in omni genere casu et numero, to use the phrase of Sganarelle." Close quote. 4. A vague confidence in progress had lain behind and encouraged the Revolution of 1789, but in the Revolution of 1848 the idea was definitely enthroned as the regnant principle. It presided over the session of the committee which drew up the Constitution of the Second Republic. Armand Marrast, the most important of the men who framed that document, based the measure of universal suffrage upon the invisible law which rules societies, the law of progress which has been so long denied but which is rooted in the nature of man. His argument was this: revolutions are due to the repression of progress, and are the expression and triumph of a progress which has been achieved. But such convulsions are an undesirable method of progressing. How can they be avoided? Only by organizing elastic institutions in which new ideas of amelioration can easily be incorporated, and laws which can be accommodated without struggle or friction to the rise of new opinions. What is needed is a flexible government open to the penetration of ideas, and the key to such a government is universal suffrage. Universal suffrage was practical politics, but the success of the Revolution fluttered agreeably all the mansions of utopia, and social reformers of every type sought to improve the occasion. In the history of the political struggles of 1848, the names are written of Proudhon, of Victor Considerant, the disciple of Fourier, of Pierre Leroux, the humanitarian communist, and his devoted pupil George Sand. The chief title of Leroux to be remembered is just his influence over the soul of the great novelist. Her later romances are pervaded by ideas derived from his teaching. His communism was vague and ineffectual, but he was one of the minor forces in the thought of the period, and there are some features in his theory which deserve to be pointed out. Leroux had begun as a member of the Saint-Simonian school, but he diverged into a path of his own. He reinstated the ideal of equality which Saint-Simon rejected, and made the approach to that ideal the measure of progress. The most significant process in history, he held, is the gradual breaking down of caste and class. The process is now approaching its completion. Today, man is synonymous with equal. In order to advance to the city of the future, we must have a force and a lever. Man is the force, and the lever is the idea of progress. It is supplied by the study of history, which displays the improvement of our faculties, the increase of our power over nature, the possibility of organizing society more efficaciously. But the force and the lever are not enough. A fulcrum is also required, and this is to be found in the solidarity of the human race. But this conception meant for Leroux something different from what is ordinarily meant by the phrase, a deeper and even mystical bond. Human solidarity was a corollary from the pantheistic religion of the Saint-Simonians, but with Leroux, as with Fourier, it was derived from the more difficult doctrine of palingenesis. We of this generation, he believed, are not merely the sons and descendants of past generations. We are the past generations themselves, which have come to birth again in us. Through many pages of the 2 volumes in which he set forth his thesis, Leroux expended much useless learning in endeavoring to establish this doctrine, which, were it true, might be the central principle in a new religion of humanity, a transformed Pythagoreanism. It is easy to understand the attractiveness of palingenesis to a believer in progress, for it would provide a solution of the anomaly that generations after generations are sacrificed for the sake of posterity, and so appear to have no value in themselves. Believers in progress, who are sensitive to the sufferings of mankind, past and present, need a stoical resolution to face this fact. We saw how Herder refused to accept it. A pantheistic faith, like that of the Saint-Simonian Church, may help some, it cannot do more, to a stoical acquiescence. The palingenesis of Leroux or Fourier removes the radical injustice. The men of each generation are sacrificed and suffer for the sake of their descendants, but as their descendants are themselves come to life again, they are really suffering in their own interests. They will themselves reach the desirable state to which the slow, painful process of history is tending. But palingenesis, notwithstanding all the ancient opinions and traditions that the researches of Leroux might muster, could carry little conviction to those who were ceasing to believe in the familiar doctrine of a future life detached from earth, and Madame Dudevant was his only distinguished convert. 5. The ascendancy of the idea of progress among thoughtful people in France in the middle of the last century is illustrated by the work which Ernest Renan composed under the immediate impression of the events of 1848. He desired to understand the significance of the current revolutionary doctrines, and was at once involved in speculation on the future of humanity. This is the purport of L'Avenir de la Science. The author was then convinced that history has a goal, and that mankind tends perpetually, though in an oscillating line, towards a more perfect state, through the growing dominion of reason over instinct and caprice. He takes the French Revolution as the critical moment in which humanity first came to know itself. That revolution was the first attempt of man to take the reins into his own hands. All that went before we may call, with Owen, the irrational period of human existence. We have now come to a point at which we must choose between two faiths. If we despair of reason, we may find a refuge from utter skepticism in a belief in the external authority of the Roman Church. If we trust reason, we must accept the march of the human mind and justify the modern spirit. And it can be justified only by proving that it is a necessary step towards perfection. Renan affirmed his belief in the second alternative and felt confident that science, including philology, on the human bearings of which he enlarged, philosophy, and art, would ultimately enable men to realize an ideal civilization, in which all would be equal. The state, he said, is the machine of progress, and the socialists are right in formulating the problem which man has to solve, though their solution is a bad one. For individual liberty, which socialism would seriously limit, is a definite conquest and ought to be preserved inviolate. Renan wrote this work in 1848 and 1849, but did not publish it at the time. He gave it to the world 40 years later. Those 40 years had robbed him of his early optimism. He continues to believe that the unfortunate conditions of our race might be ameliorated by science, but he denounces the view that men can ever be equal. Inequality is written in nature. It is not only a necessary consequence of liberty, but a necessary postulate of progress. There will always be a superior minority. He criticizes himself, too, for having fallen into the error of Hegel and assigned to man an unduly important place in the universe. In 1890 there was nothing left of the sentimental socialism which he had studied in 1848. It had been blown away by the cold wind of scientific socialism which Marx and Engels created, and Renan had come to think that in this new form socialism would triumph. Footnote. He reckoned without the new forces, opposed to socialism as well as to parliamentary democracy, represented by Bakunin and men like Georges Sorel. End of footnote. He had criticized Comte for believing that, quote, man lives exclusively by science, or rather little verbal tags like geometrical theorems, dry formulae. Close quote. Was he satisfied by the concrete doctrine of Marx that all the phenomena of civilization at a given period are determined by the methods of production and distribution which then prevail? But the future of socialism is a minor issue, and the ultimate goal of humanity is quite uncertain. Quote, ce qu'il y a de consolant, c'est qu'on arrive nécessairement quelque part. Close quote. We may console ourselves with the certainty that we must get somewhere. 6. Proudhon described the idea of progress as the railway of liberty. It certainly supplied motive power to social ideals which were repugnant and alarming to the authorities of the Catholic Church. At the Vatican it was clearly seen that the idea was a powerful engine driven by an enemy, and in the famous Syllabus of Errors which Pope Pius IX flung in the face of the modern world at the end of 1864, progress had the honor of being censured. The 80th error, which closes the list, runs thus: Romanus Pontifex potest ac debet cum progressu, cum liberalismo et cum recenti civilitate sese reconciliare et componere. Quote, the Roman Pontiff can, and ought to, be reconciled and come to terms with progress, with liberalism, and with modern civilization. Close quote. No wonder, seeing that progress was invoked to justify every movement that offended the nostrils of the Vatican: liberalism, toleration, democracy, and socialism. And the Roman Church well understood the intimate connection of the idea with the advance of rationalism. End of section 21. Section 22 of The Idea of Progress by J.B. Barry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Material Progress, the Exhibition of 1851. 1. It is not easy for a new idea of the speculative order to penetrate and inform the general consciousness of a community until it has assumed some external and concrete embodiment or is recommended by some striking material evidence. In the case of progress, both these conditions were fulfilled in the period 1820 to 1850. In the Saint-Simonian Church, and in the attempts of Owen and Cabet to found ideal societies, people saw practical enterprises inspired by the idea. They might have no sympathy with these enterprises, but their attention was attracted. And at the same time they were witnessing a rapid transformation of the external conditions of life, a movement to the continuation of which there seemed no reason for setting any limit in the future. The spectacular results of the advance of science and mechanical technique brought home to the mind of the average man the conception of an indefinite increase of man's power over nature as his brain penetrated her secrets. This evident material progress, which has continued incessantly ever since, has been a mainstay of the general belief in progress which is prevalent today. England was the leader in this material progress, of which the particulars are familiar and need not be enumerated here. The discovery of the power of steam and the potentialities of coal revolutionized the conditions of life. Men who were born at the beginning of the century had seen, before they had passed the age of 30, the rapid development of steam navigation, the illumination of towns and houses by gas, the opening of the first railway. It was just before this event, the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which showed how machinery would abbreviate space as it had revolutionized industry, that Southey published his Sir Thomas More or Colloquies on the Progress of Society, 1829. There we see the effect of the new force on his imagination. Steam, he says, will govern the world next, and shake it too before its empire is established. The biographer of Nelson devotes a whole conversation to the subject of steam and war. But the theme of the book is the question of moral and social progress, on which the author inclines to the view that, quote, the world will continue to improve even as it has hitherto been continually improving, and that the progress of knowledge and the diffusion of Christianity will bring about at last, when men become Christian in reality as well as in name, something like that utopian state of which philosophers have loved to dream. Close quote. This admission of progress, cautious though it was, circumscribed by reserves and compromised by hesitations, coming from such a conservative pillar of church and state as Southey, is a notable sign of the times when we remember that the idea was still associated then with revolution and heresy. It is significant, too, that at the same time an octogenarian mathematician of Aberdeen was composing a book on the same subject. Hamilton's Progress of Society is now utterly forgotten, but it must have contributed in its day to propagating the same moderate view of progress, consistent with orthodoxy, which Southey held. Quote, the belief of the perfectibility of human nature and the attainment of a golden age in which vice and misery have no place will only be entertained by an enthusiast. But an inquiry into the means of improving our nature and enlarging our happiness is consistent with sober reason, and is the most important subject, merely human, that can engage the mind of man. Close quote. Footnote. The book was published posthumously by Murray in 1830, a year after the author's death. End of footnote. 2. We have been told by Tennyson that when he went by the first train from Liverpool to Manchester, 1830, he thought that the wheels ran in grooves. Quote, "Then I made this line, 'Let the great world spin forever down the ringing grooves of change.'" Close quote. Locksley Hall, which was published in 1842, illustrates how the idea of progress had begun to creep into the imagination of Englishmen. Though subsidiary to a love story, it is the true theme of the poem. The pulsation of eager interest in the terrestrial destinies of humanity, the large excitement of living in a wondrous mother age, dreams of the future, quicken the passion of the hero's youth. His disappointment in love disenchants him. He sees the reverse side of civilization, but at last he finds an anodyne for his palsied heart in a more sober version of his earlier faith, a chastened belief in his mother age. He can at least discern an increasing purpose in history, and can be sure that the thoughts of men are widened with the process of the suns. The novelty of the poem lay in finding a cathartic cure for a private sorrow, not in religion or in nature, but in the modern idea of progress. It may be said to mark a stage in the career of the idea. The view of civilization which Tennyson took as his motif had no revolutionary implications, suggested no impatience or anger with the past. The startling prospect unfolding itself before Europe is the long result of time, and history is justified by the promise of today. The centuries behind me like a fruitful land reposed. Very different was the spirit in which another great poet composed, nearly 20 years later, a wonderful hymn of progress. Victor Hugo's Plein Ciel, in his epic La Légende des siècles, announces a new era of the world in which man, the triumphant rebel, delivered from his past, will move freely forward on a glorious way. The poet is inspired not by faith in a continuous development throughout the ages, but by the old spirit of the Revolution, and he sees in the past only a heavy chain which the race at last flings off. The horrible past has gone, not to return. Ce monde est mort. And the poem is at once a paean on man's victorious rebellion against it, and a dithyramb on the prospect of his future. Man is imagined as driving through the heavens an aerial car to which the four winds are harnessed, mounting above the clouds and threatening to traverse the ether. Superbe, il plane avec un hymne en ses agrès, et l'on voit voir passer la strophe du progrès. Il est la nef, il est la phare. L'homme enfin prend son sceptre et jette son bâton, et l'on voit s'envoler le calcul de Newton monté sur l'ode de Pindare. But if this vision foreshadows the conquest of the air, its significance is symbolic rather than literal, and, like Pindar checking the steeds of his song, Hugo returns to earth. Pas si loin, pas si haut, redescendons. Restons l'homme, restons Adam. Mais non l'homme à tâtons, mais non la dame tombée. Tout autre rêve altère l'espèce d'idéal qui convient à la terre. Contentons-nous du mot meilleur écrit partout. Dawn has appeared after 6,000 years in the fatal way, and man, freed by the invisible hand from the weight of his chains, has embarked for new shores. Où va-t-il ce navire? Il va de jour vêtu à l'avenir divin et pur, à la vertu, à la science qu'on voit luire, à la mort des fléaux, à l'oubli généreux, à l'abondance, au calme, au rire, à l'homme heureux, il va, ce glorieux navire. Oh, ce navire fait le voyage sacré. C'est l'ascension bleue à son premier degré. Hors de l'antique et vie des cambres. Hors de la pesanteur, c'est l'avenir fondé, c'est le destin de l'homme à la fin évadé, qui lève l'ancre et sort de l'ombre. The union of humanity in a universal commonwealth, which Tennyson had expressed as the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, the goal of many theorists of progress, becomes in Hugo's imagination something more sublime. The magic ship of man's destiny is to compass the cosmopolis of the Stoics, a terrestrial order in harmony with the whole universe. Nef magique et suprême, elle a, rien qu'en marchant, changé le cri terrestre en pur et joyeux chant, rajeuni les races flétries, établi l'ordre vrai, montré le chemin sûr, Dieu juste, et fait entrer dans l'homme tant d'azur qu'elle a supprimé les patries. Faisant à l'homme avec le ciel une cité, une pensée avec toute l'immensité, elle abolit les vieilles règles. Elle abaisse les monts, elle annule les tours. Splendide, elle introduit les peuples, marche sur l'eau dans la communion des aigles. 3. Between 1830 and 1850, railway transport spread throughout Great Britain and was introduced on the continent, and electricity was subdued to man's use by the invention of telegraphy. The Great Exhibition of London in 1851 was, in one of its aspects, a public recognition of the material progress of the age and the growing power of man over the physical world. Its aim, said a contemporary, was, quote, to seize the living scroll of human progress inscribed with every successive conquest of man's intellect. Close quote. The Prince Consort, who originated the exhibition, explained its significance in a public speech. Quote, nobody who has paid any attention to the peculiar features of our present era will doubt for a moment that we are living at a period of most wonderful transition, which tends rapidly to accomplish that great end to which indeed all history points, the realization of the unity of mankind. The distances which separated the different nations and parts of the globe are rapidly vanishing before the achievements of modern invention, and we can traverse them with incredible ease. The languages of all nations are known, and their acquirements placed within the reach of everybody. Thought is communicated with the rapidity and even by the power of lightning. On the other hand, the great principle of division of labor, which may be called the moving power of civilization, is being extended to all branches of science, industry, and art. Gentlemen, the exhibition of 1851 is to give us a true test and a living picture of the point of development at which the whole of mankind has arrived in this great task, and a new starting point from which all nations will be able to direct their further exertions. Close quote. Footnote. The speech was delivered at a banquet at the Mansion House on March 21, 1850. End of footnote. The point emphasized here is the solidarity of the world. The exhibition is to bring home to men's consciousness the community of all the inhabitants of the earth. The assembled peoples, wrote Thackeray in his May Day Ode, quote, see the sumptuous banquet set, the brotherhood of nations met around the feast. Close quote. Footnote. Published in the Times, April 30, 1851. The exhibition was opened on May 1st. End of footnote. And this was the note struck in the leading article of the Times on the opening day, quote, the first morning since the creation that all peoples have assembled from all parts of the world and done a common act. Close quote. It was claimed that the exhibition signified a new, intelligent, and moral movement which marks a great crisis in the history of the world and foreshadows universal peace. England, said another writer, produced Bacon and Newton, the two philosophers, quote, who first lent direction and force to the stream of industrial science. We have been the first also to give the widest possible base to the watchtower of international progress, which seeks the formation of the physical well-being of man and the extinction of the meaner jealousies of commerce. Close quote. These quotations show that the Great Exhibition was at the time optimistically regarded not merely as a record of material achievements, but as a demonstration that humanity was at last well on its way to a better and happier state, through the falling of barriers and the resulting insight that the interests of all are closely interlocked. A vista was suggested, at the end of which far-sighted people might think they discerned Tennyson's Federation of the World. 4. Since the exhibition, Western civilization has advanced steadily, and in some respects more rapidly than any sober mind could have predicted. Civilization, at least in the conventional sense, which has been not badly defined as, quote, the development of material ease, of education, of equality, and of aspirations to rise and succeed in life. Close quote. The most striking advance has been in the technical conveniences of life, that is, in the control over natural forces. It would be superfluous to enumerate the discoveries and inventions since 1850 which have abridged space, economized time, eased bodily suffering, and reduced in some ways the friction of life, though they have increased it in others. This uninterrupted series of technical inventions, proceeding concurrently with immense enlargements of all branches of knowledge, has gradually accustomed the least speculative mind to the conception that civilization is naturally progressive, and that continuous improvement is part of the order of things. So far, the hopes of 1851 have been fulfilled. But against all this technical progress, with the enormous expansion of industry and commerce, dazzling to the man in the marketplace when he pauses to reflect, have to be set the exploitation and sufferings of industrial workers, the distress of intense economic competition, the heavier burdens of preparation for modern war. The very increase of material ease seemed unavoidably to involve conditions inconsistent with universal happiness, and the communications which linked the peoples of the world together modified the methods of warfare instead of bringing peace. Quote, Toutes nos merveilleuses inventions sont aussi puissantes pour le mal que pour le bien. Close quote. One fact, indeed, might be taken as an index that humanity was morally advancing: the abolition of slavery in America at the price of a long and sanguinary war. Yet some triumphs of philanthropy hardly seemed to endanger the conclusion that, while knowledge is indefinitely progressive, there is no good reason for sanguine hopes that man is perfectible or that universal happiness is attainable. A thoughtful writer observed, discussing progress in 1864, that the innumerable individual steps in the growth of knowledge and business organization have not been combined so far to produce a general advance in the happiness of life. Each step brings increase of pressure. Yet in spite of all adverse facts and many eminent dissenters, the belief in social progress has on the whole prevailed. This triumph of optimism was promoted by the victory of a revolutionary hypothesis in another field of inquiry which suddenly electrified the world. End of section 22. Section 23 of The Idea of Progress by J. B. Barry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Progress in the Light of Evolution. 1. In the 60s of the 19th century, the idea of progress entered upon the third period of its history. During the first period, up to the French Revolution, it had been treated rather casually. It was taken for granted and received no searching examination either from philosophers or from historians. In the second period, its immense significance was apprehended, and a search began for a general law which would define and establish it. The study of sociology was founded, and at the same time the impressive results of science, applied to the conveniences of life, advertised the idea. It harmonized with the notion of development, which had become current both in natural science and in metaphysics. Socialists and other political reformers appealed to it as a gospel. By 1850 it was a familiar idea in Europe, but was not yet universally accepted as obviously true. The notion of social progress had been growing in the atmosphere of the notion of biological development, but this development still seemed a highly precarious speculation. The fixity of species and the creation of man, defended by powerful interests and prejudices, were attacked but were not shaken. The hypothesis of organic evolution was much in the same position as the Copernican hypothesis in the 16th century. Then, in 1859, Darwin intervened, like Galileo. The appearance of the origin of species changed the situation by disproving definitely the dogma of fixity of species and assigning real causes for transformism. What might be set aside before as a brilliant guess was elevated to the rank of a scientific hypothesis, and the following 20 years were enlivened by the struggle around the evolution of life, against prejudices chiefly theological, resulting in the victory of the theory. The origin of species led to the third stage of the fortunes of the idea of progress. We saw how the heliocentric astronomy, by dethroning man from his privileged position in the universe of space and throwing him back on his own efforts, had helped that idea to compete with the idea of a busy providence. He now suffers a new degradation within the compass of his own planet. Evolution, shearing him of his glory as a rational being specially created to be the lord of the earth, traces a humble pedigree for him. And this second degradation was the decisive fact which has established the reign of the idea of progress. 2. Evolution itself, it must be remembered, does not necessarily mean, applied to society, the movement of man to a desirable goal. It is a neutral scientific conception, compatible either with optimism or with pessimism. According to different estimates, it may appear to be a cruel sentence or a guarantee of steady amelioration, and it has been actually interpreted in both ways. In order to base progress on evolution, two distinct arguments are required. If it could be shown that social life obeys the same general laws of evolution as nature, and also that the process involves an increase of happiness, then progress would be as valid a hypothesis as the evolution of living forms. Darwin had concluded his treatise with these words, quote, "As all the living forms of life are the lineal descendants of those which lived long before the Silurian epoch, we may feel certain that the ordinary succession by generation has never once been broken, and that no cataclysm has desolated the whole world. Hence we may look with some confidence to a secure future of equally inappreciable length, and as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental environments will tend to progress towards perfection." Close quote. Here the evolutionist struck the note of optimism, and he suggested that laws of progress would be found in other quarters than those where they had hitherto been sought. The ablest and most influential development of the argument from evolution to progress was the work of Spencer. He extended the principle of evolution to sociology and ethics, and was the most conspicuous interpreter of it in an optimistic sense. He had been an evolutionist long before Darwin's decisive intervention, and in 1851 he had published his Social Statics, which, although he had not yet worked out the evolutionary laws which he began to formulate soon afterwards, and was still a theist, exhibits the general trend of his optimistic philosophy. Progress here appears as the basis of a theory of ethics. The title indicates the influence of Comte, but the argument is sharply opposed to the spirit of Comte's teaching, and sociology is treated in a new way. Footnote: Social Statics, or the conditions essential to human happiness specified and the first of them developed, is the full title. End of footnote. Spencer begins by arguing that the constancy of human nature, so frequently alleged, is a fallacy. For change is the law of all things, of every single object as well as of the universe. Nature in its infinite complexity is ever growing to a new development. It would be strange if, in this universal mutation, man alone were unchangeable, and it is not true. He also obeys the law of indefinite variation. Contrast the houseless savages with Newtons and Shakespeare's. Between these extremes there are countless degrees of difference. If, then, humanity is indefinitely variable, perfectibility is possible. In the second place, evil is not a permanent necessity. For all evil results from the non-adaptation of the organism to its conditions. This is true of everything that lives, and it is equally true that evil perpetually tends to disappear. In virtue of an essential principle of life, this non-adaptation of organisms to their conditions is ever being rectified, and one or both continue to be modified until the adaptation is perfect. And this applies to the mental as well as to the physical sphere. In the present state of the world, men suffer many evils, and this shows that their characters are not yet adjusted to the social state. Now the qualification requisite for the social state is that each individual shall have such desires only as may fully be satisfied without trenching upon the ability of others to obtain similar satisfaction. This qualification is not yet fulfilled, because civilized man retains some of the characteristics which were suitable for the conditions of his earlier predatory life. He needed one moral constitution for his primitive state, he needs quite another for his present state. The resultant is a process of adaptation which has been going on for a long time, and will go on for a long time to come. Civilization represents the adaptations which have already been accomplished. Progress means the successive steps of the process. That by this process man will eventually become suited to his mode of life, Spencer has no doubts. All excess and deficiency of suitable faculties must disappear. In other words, all imperfection. Quote, "The ultimate development of the ideal man is logically certain as any conclusion in which we place the most implicit faith, for instance, that all men will die." Close quote. Here is the theory of perfectibility asserted on new grounds, with a confidence not less assured than that of Condorcet or Godwin. Progress then is not an accident, but a necessity. Civilization is a part of nature, being a development of man's latent capabilities under the action of favorable circumstances which were certain at some time or other to occur. Here Spencer's argument assumes a final cause. The ultimate purpose of creation, he asserts, is to produce the greatest amount of happiness, and to fulfill this aim it is necessary that each member of the race should possess faculties enabling him to experience the highest enjoyment of life, yet in such a way as not to diminish the power of others to receive like satisfaction. Beings thus constituted cannot multiply in a world tenanted by inferior creatures. These, therefore, must be dispossessed to make room. And to dispossess them, aboriginal man must have an inferior constitution to begin with. He must be predatory, he must have the desire to kill. In general, given an unsubdued earth, and the human being appointed to overspread and occupy it, then, the laws of life being what they are, no other series of changes than that which has actually occurred could have occurred. The argument might be put in a form free from the assumption of a final cause, and without introducing the conception of a divine providence, which in this work Spencer adopted, though in his later philosophy it was superseded by the conception of the unknowable existing behind all phenomena. But the role of the divine ruler is simply to set in motion immutable forces to realize his design. Quote, "In the moral as in the material world, accumulated evidence is gradually generating the conviction that events are not at bottom fortuitous, but that they are wrought out in a certain inevitable way by unchanging forces." Close quote. The optimism of Spencer's view could not be surpassed. After patient study, he writes, quote, "This chaos of phenomena into the midst of which he, man, was born has begun to generalize itself to him." Close quote. Instead of confusion, he begins to discern, quote, "the dim outlines of a gigantic plan. No accidents, no chance, but everywhere order and completeness. One by one, exceptions vanish, and all becomes systematic. Always towards perfection is the mighty movement, towards a complete development and a more unmixed good. Subordinating in its universality all petty irregularities and fallings back, as the curvature of the earth subordinates mountains and valleys. Even in evils the student learns to recognize only a struggling beneficence. But above all he is struck with the inherent sufficingness of things." Close quote. But the movement towards harmony, the elimination of evil, will not be effected by idealists imposing their constructions upon the world or by authoritarian governments. It means gradual adaptation, gradual psychological change, and its life is individual liberty. It proceeds by the give and take of opposed opinions. Guizot had said, progress and at the same time resistance. And Spencer conceives that resistance is beneficial, so long as it comes from those who honestly think that the institutions they defend are really the best and the proposed innovations absolutely wrong. It will be observed that Spencer's doctrine of perfectibility rests on an entirely different basis from the doctrine of the 18th century. It is one thing to deduce it from an abstract psychology which holds that human nature is unresistingly plastic in the hands of the legislator and the instructor. It is another to argue that human nature is subject to the general law of change, and that the process by which it slowly but continuously tends to adapt itself more and more to the conditions of social life, children inheriting the acquired aptitudes of their parents, points to an ultimate harmony. Here, profitable legislation and education are auxiliary to the process of unconscious adaptation, and respond to the psychological changes in the community, changes which reveal themselves in public opinion. 3. During the following 10 years, Spencer was investigating the general laws of evolution and planning his synthetic philosophy, which was to explain the development of the universe. He aimed at showing that laws of change are discoverable which control all phenomena alike, inorganic, biological, psychical, and social. In the light of this hypothesis, the actual progression of humanity is established as a necessary fact, a sequel of the general cosmic movement and governed by the same principles. And if that progression is shown to involve increasing happiness, the theory of progress is established. The first section of the work, First Principles, appeared in 1862. The biology, the psychology, and finally the sociology followed during the next 20 years. And the synthesis of the world process which these volumes lucidly and persuasively developed probably did more than any other work, at least in England, both to drive home the significance of the doctrine of evolution and to raise the doctrine of progress to the rank of a commonplace truth in popular estimation, an axiom to which political rhetoric might effectively appeal. Many of those who were allured by Spencer's gigantic synthesis hardly realized that his theory of social evolution, of the gradual psychical improvement of the race, depends upon the validity of the assumption that parents transmit to their children faculties and aptitudes which they have themselves acquired. On this question experts notoriously differ. Some day it will probably be definitely decided, and perhaps in Spencer's favor. But the theory of continuous psychical improvement by a process of nature encounters an obvious difficulty, which did not escape some critics of Spencer, in the prominent fact of history that every great civilization of the past progressed to a point at which instead of advancing further, it stood still and declined, to become the prey of younger societies, or, if it survived, to stagnate. Arrest, decadence, stagnation has been the rule. It is not easy to reconcile this phenomenon with the theory of mental improvement. The receptive attitude of the public towards such a philosophy as Spencer's had been made possible by Darwin's discoveries, which were reinforced by the growing science of paleontology and the accumulating material evidence of the great antiquity of man. By the simultaneous advances of geology and biology, man's perspective in time was revolutionized, just as the Copernican astronomy had revolutionized his perspective in space. Many thoughtful and many thoughtless people were ready to discern, as Huxley suggested, in man's, quote, long progress through the past a reasonable ground of faith in his attainment of a nobler future. Close quote. The recorded portion of his long progress through the past was indeed not altogether pleasant to look back on for anyone gifted with imagination, and Winwood Reade, a young African traveler, exhibited it in a vivid book as a long drawn-out martyrdom. But he was a disciple of Spencer, and his hopes for the future were as bright as his picture of the past was dark. The Martyrdom of Man, published in 1872, was so widely read that it reached an 8th edition 12 years later, and may be counted as one of the agencies which popularized Spencer's optimism. That optimism was not endorsed by all the contemporary leaders of thought. Lotze had asserted emphatically in 1864 that human nature will not change, and afterwards he saw no reason to alter his conviction. Quote, never one fold and one shepherd, never one uniform culture for all mankind, never universal nobleness. Our virtue and happiness can only flourish amid an active conflict with wrong. If every stumbling block were smoothed away, men would no longer be like men, but like a flock of innocent brutes, feeding on good things provided by nature as at the very beginning of their course. Close quote. Footnote. Microcosmos, English translation, page 300. The first German edition, 3 volumes, appeared in 1856-64. The third, from which the English translation was made, in 1876. Lotze was optimistic as to the durability of modern civilization. Quote, no one will profess to foreknow the future, but as far as men may judge, it seems that in our days there are greater safeguards than there were in antiquity against unjustifiable excesses and against the external forces which might endanger the continued existence of civilization. Close quote. End of footnote. But even if we reject with Spencer the old dictum, endorsed by Lotze as by Fontenelle, that human nature is immutable, the dictum of ultimate harmony encounters the following objection. If the social environment were stable, it is easy to argue, quote, it could be admitted that man's nature, variable ex hypothesi, could gradually adapt itself to it, and that finally a definite equilibrium would be established. But the environment is continually changing as the consequence of man's very efforts to adapt himself. Every step he takes to harmonize his needs and his conditions produces a new discord and confronts him with a new problem. In other words, there is no reason to believe that the reciprocal process which goes on in the growth of society between men's natures and the environment they are continually modifying will ever reach an equilibrium, or even that, as the character of the discords changes, the suffering which they cause diminishes. Close quote. In fact, upon the neutral fact of evolution, a theory of pessimism may be built up as speciously as a theory of optimism. And such a theory was built up with great power and ability by the German philosopher E. von Hartmann, whose Philosophy of the Unconscious appeared in 1869. Leaving aside his metaphysics and his grotesque theory of the destiny of the universe, we see here and in his subsequent works how plausibly a convinced evolutionist could revive the view of Rousseau that civilization and happiness are mutually antagonistic, and that progress means an increase of misery. Huxley himself, one of the most eminent interpreters of the doctrine of evolution, did not, in his late years at least, entertain very sanguine views of mankind. Quote, I know of no study which is so saddening as that of the evolution of humanity as it is set forth in the annals of history. Man is a brute, only more intelligent than other brutes, and even the best of modern civilizations appears to me to exhibit a condition of mankind which neither embodies any worthy ideal nor even possesses the merit of stability. Close quote. There may be some hope of a large improvement, but otherwise he would welcome a kindly comet to sweep the whole affair away. and he came to the final conclusion that such an improvement could only set in by deliberately resisting, instead of cooperating with, the processes of nature. Quote, social progress means the checking of the cosmic process at every step and the substitution for it of another which may be called the ethical process. Close quote. Footnote. Huxley considers progress exclusively from an ethical, not from a eudaimonic point of view. End of footnote. How in a few centuries can man hope to gain the mastery over the cosmic process which has been at work for millions of years? The theory of evolution encourages no millennial anticipations. I have quoted these views to illustrate that evolution lends itself to a pessimistic as well as to an optimistic interpretation. The question whether it leads in a desirable direction or not is answered according to the temperament of the inquirer. In an age of prosperity and self-complacency, the affirmative answer was readily received, and the term evolution attracted to itself in common speech the implications of value which belong to progress. It may be noticed that the self-complacency of the age was promoted by the popularization of scientific knowledge. A rapidly growing demand, especially in England, for books and lectures, making the results of science accessible and interesting to the lay public, is a remarkable feature of the second half of the 19th century, and to supply this demand was a remunerative enterprise. This popular literature explaining the wonders of the physical world was at the same time subtly flushing the imaginations of men with the consciousness that they were living in an era which, in itself vastly superior to any age of the past, need be burdened by no fear of decline or catastrophe, but trusting in the boundless resources of science might securely defy fate. 4. Thus, in the 70s and 80s of the last century, the idea of progress was becoming a general article of faith. Some might hold it in the fatalistic form that humanity moves in a desirable direction, whatever men do or may leave undone. Others might believe that the future will depend largely on our own conscious efforts, but that there is nothing in the nature of things to disappoint the prospect of steady and indefinite advance. The majority did not inquire too curiously into such points of doctrine, but received it in a vague sense as a comfortable addition to their convictions. But it became a part of the general mental outlook of educated people. When Mr. Frederick Harrison delivered in 1889 at Manchester an eloquent discourse on the New Era, in which the dominant note is the faith in human progress in lieu of celestial rewards of the separate soul, his general argument could appeal to immensely wider circles than the positivists whom he was specially addressing. The dogma, for a dogma it remains in spite of the confidence of Comte or of Spencer that he had made it a scientific hypothesis, has produced an important ethical principle. Consideration for posterity has throughout history operated as a motive of conduct, but feebly, occasionally, and in a very limited sense. With the doctrine of progress, it assumes, logically, a preponderating importance, for the center of interest is transferred to the life of future generations who are to enjoy conditions of happiness denied to us, but which our labors and sufferings are to help to bring about. If the doctrine is held in an extreme fatalistic form, then our duty is to resign ourselves cheerfully to sacrifices for the sake of unknown descendants, just as ordinary altruism enjoins the cheerful acceptance of sacrifices for the sake of living fellow creatures. Winwood Reade indicated this when he wrote, quote, "Our own prosperity is founded on the agonies of the past. Is it therefore unjust that we also should suffer for the benefit of those who are to come?" Close quote. But if it is held that each generation can by its own deliberate acts determine for good or evil the destinies of the race, then our duties towards others reach out through time as well as through space, and our contemporaries are only a negligible fraction of the neighbors to whom we owe obligations. The ethical end may still be formulated, with the utilitarians, as the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Only the greatest number includes, as Kidd observed, the members of generations yet unborn or unthought of. This extension of the moral code, if it is not yet conspicuous in treatises on ethics, has in late years been obtaining recognition in practice. 5. Within the last 40 years, nearly every civilized country has produced a large literature on social science, in which indefinite progress is generally assumed as an axiom. But the law whose investigation Kant designated as the task for a Newton, which Saint-Simon and Comte did not find, and to which Spencer's evolutionary formula would stand in the same relation as it stands to the law of gravitation, remains still undiscovered. To examine or even glance at this literature, or to speculate how theories of progress may be modified by recent philosophical speculation, lies beyond the scope of this volume, which is only concerned with tracing the origin of the idea and its growth up to the time when it became a current creed. Looking back on the course of the inquiry, we note how the history of the idea has been connected with the growth of modern science, with the growth of rationalism, and with the struggle for political and religious liberty. The precursors, Baudin and Bacon, lived at a time when the world was consciously emancipating itself from the authority of tradition, and it was being discovered that liberty is a difficult theoretical problem. The idea took definite shape in France when the old scheme of the universe had been shattered by the victory of the new astronomy, and the prestige of Providence, Comte supercilio moentis, was paling before the majesty of the immutable laws of nature. There began a slow but steady reinstatement of the kingdom of this world. The otherworldly dreams of theologians, ceux qui reniaient la terre pour patrie, which had ruled so long, lost their power, and men's earthly home again insinuated itself into their affections, but with the new hope of its becoming a place fit for reasonable beings to live in. We have seen how the belief that our race is traveling towards earthly happiness was propagated by some eminent thinkers, as well as by some not very fortunate persons who had a good deal of time on their hands. And all these high priests and incense bearers to whom the creed owes its success were rationalists, from the author of the Histoire des Oracles to the philosopher of the unknowable. Epilogue. In achieving its ascendancy and unfolding its meaning, the idea of progress had to overcome a psychological obstacle which may be described as the illusion of finality. It is quite easy to fancy a state of society, vastly different from ours, existing in some unknown place like heaven. It is much more difficult to realize as a fact that the order of things with which we are familiar has so little stability that our actual descendants may be born into a world as different from ours as ours is from that of our ancestors of the Pleistocene age. The illusion of finality is strong. The men of the Middle Ages would have found it hard to imagine that a time was not far off in which the Last Judgment would have ceased to arouse any emotional interest. In the sphere of speculation, Hegel and even Comte illustrate this psychological limitation. They did not recognize that their own systems could not be final any more than the system of Aristotle or of Descartes. It is science, perhaps more than anything else, the wonderful history of science in the last 100 years, that has helped us to transcend this illusion. But if we accept the reasonings on which the dogma of progress is based, must we not carry them to their full conclusion? In escaping from the illusion of finality, is it legitimate to exempt that dogma itself? Must not it, too, submit to its own negation of finality? Will not that process of change, for which progress is the optimistic name, compel progress, too, to fall from the commanding position in which it is now, with apparent security enthroned? Esetai emar otan. A day will come, in the revolution of centuries, when a new idea will usurp its place as the directing idea of humanity. Another star, unnoticed now or invisible, will climb up the intellectual heaven, and human emotions will react to its influence, human plans respond to its guidance. It will be the criterion by which progress and all other ideas will be judged, and it too will have its successor. In other words, does not progress itself suggest that its value as a doctrine is only relative, corresponding to a certain not very advanced stage of civilization, just as Providence, in its day, was an idea of relative value corresponding to a stage somewhat less advanced? Or will it be said that this argument is merely a disconcerting trick of dialectic played under cover of the darkness in which the issue of the future is safely hidden by Horace's prudent God? End of section 23. End of the idea of progress, an inquiry into its origin and growth by John Bagnell Bury.